One of the big points in the discussion has always been that the discussion in Germany has focused very much on the idea, yes, the European Central Bank has a mandate, that's price stability, but it should also take into account the externalities, the side effects, the effects on other policymakers that it has. And that has been a central theme in the discussion in Germany. What are the effects on banks, on financial institutions? What are its effects on fiscal policy? And to some extent, you can see the OMT program as being too successful, right? Because it has reduced market pressure, it has calmed down markets, it has brought time to policymakers, and you could argue that that time may not always be used to the fullest extent. So the question is, what would happen if you had not had the OMT announcement last summer? Maybe would have made much more progress, for instance, on banking union or other important policy measures. The crucial question to me is should the European Central Bank take that into account? Is it the mandate, within the mandate, to consider these externalities or side effects on other policymakers or other institutions in its reaction function? And the answer, in my view, should be to that, yes, it has to take that into account to the extent that it influences its mandate of price stability. The question is, ultimately, and I think that's where I hope the discussion will go today as well, what are the goals that the European Central Bank should be focusing on? What are the issues that are absolutely crucial to achieve price stability, not just over the medium term, which is its mandate, but also to ensure price stability over the longer term? And here credibility is a crucial element for a central bank to achieve its mandate. I also hope the discussion today focuses on the policy options, to think what are the policy options we need, just not only within the realm of monetary policy making, but more broadly on economic policy making in Europe, and what institutional changes do we need, particularly, for instance, on banking union and others to get us out of the crisis.
Die Konferenz The ECB and its OMT Programme, die vom Deutschen Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung zusammen mit dem Centre for Economic Policy Research veranstaltet wurde, fand am 2. September in den Räumen der KfW Bankengruppe in Berlin statt. Thema der Konferenz war das OMT-Programm der Europäischen Zentralbank, also der Kauf von Staatsanleihen im Euroraum durch die EZB. Da diese Outright Monetary Transactions unter Ökonomen umstritten sind, zeichnete sich eine lebhafte Diskussion ab.
My belief is that we are making good progress. And what role, what limits the OMT program can play in getting on with this progress is certainly controversial. There are a lot of different views, legal views. We have even our constitutional law working on this question, and there will be certainly a lot of controversial discussions here today. I think that is very necessary, and I hope that at the end of the day we will all go away with new insights into this role of the ECB and the OMT program.
Rechtliche Fragen spielten eine große Rolle. Nicht zuletzt, weil das OMT-Programm der EZB momentan vor dem deutschen Bundesverfassungsgericht verhandelt wird.
The treaty prohibits direct funding of governments by the ECB. The treaty also permits open market operations without any restrictions. So, are secondary market purchases of government debt allowed? Answer 1, no, because that would permit arbitraging the prohibition of direct funding of governments by the central bank. Answer number 2, yes, because the treaty only prohibits direct funding, and it does allow open market operations without restriction. Now, both of these arguments are legitimate legal arguments. You see both types of arguments in legal practice, and I've seen this in competition policy quite a number of times. Recurringly, that's a situation where the legal norm simply is unclear, and we go to a court to ask, what is the law? And the court will adjudicate the issue, presumably on political grounds, and say it's a legal argument. In this particular case, we have the interesting constellation that the court that's in charge is the ECJ in Luxembourg, but the case is being handled in front of the German Constitutional Court, which is not the ultimate arbiter of the legal question. Now, the German Constitutional Court a year ago has introduced the idea that it depends on objectives. So it's illegal if it's intended to circumvent the prohibition of direct funding, and it's legal if it's intended to pursue monetary policy objectives. How do you distinguish between the two? But I think there is a deeper issue. The moment you focus on objectives, you really endanger the independence of the institution. If I was to say a court ruling that's motivated by political reasons is outside the mandate of the court, whereas a court ruling that just interprets the legal norms is what they should be doing, the court will tell me, mind your own business. We are doing what we do independently. And I think that this is one of the issues involved which has been considered to look.
Thematisiert wurde mehrfach auch der Aufruf, der im Vorfeld von den Initiatoren der Konferenz veröffentlicht wurde. Der Aufruf zur Unterstützung des Anleihenkaufprogramms OMT der Europäischen Zentralbank von Marcel Fratzscher, Francesco Giavazzi, Richard Portes, Beatrice Weder Mauro und Charles Wyplosz stieß bei mehreren Referenten auf inhaltliche Kritik.
The question is, are the arguments straightforward, convincing? And if not, does this verdict not sound a bit arrogant? First, on the substance. I quote, on the substance, the criticisms are based on a faulty understanding of the responsibilities of central banks. In its role as lender of last resort, a central bank must ensure that its liquidity reaches all parts of the economy. This seems to me a new or rather strange interpretation of the role of lender of last resort, which is usually defined by Bedshot as providing unlimited liquidity to illiquid but solid banks at a penalty rate. It is obvious that OMT is not in line with this definition. But leaving terminology aside, to claim that, I quote, the OMT program is an essential monetary policy element for the ECB to be able to fulfill its primary mandate of achieving price stability is for me difficult to understand. What are the theoretical and empirical arguments that you need this instrument to make monetary policy able to fulfill the mandate of price stability? And to refer to the actions of the Bundesbank in purchasing financial assets, that is government bonds in the past, as an act of lender of last resort is just wrong. In fact, once the ECB will start this program, hopefully it will never happen. This is a rosy scenario which is not excluded, it's not impossible. But once the ECB will start this program, I think it will become prisoner of politics and markets. Of politics, because the central bank will have to rely on the conditionality defined by politics, by Brussels, Commission, Council, etc. Could one imagine that the ECB would say no, because labour market reforms highly praised by Brussels do not meet reasonable standards? The ECB turns into a prisoner of markets because it is hard to expect that the ECB would consider suspending interventions if conditionality is not fulfilled. The foreseeable turmoil in markets would deliver a strong argument in this moment not to withdraw from intervention.
Finally, the call for support for the OMT program describes government bond purchases as a regular monetary policy instrument. And it is obvious, and Martin Helbig has referred to that other central banks use the tool and that monetary policy is technically capable of doing this. But as I have already indicated, there are fundamental and important differences between the various institutional frameworks. Moreover, I would ask you to bear in mind that the nature of the system is very different compared with other countries. While, for example, the Fed and the Bank of England purchased top-rated bonds issued by the central government, and in doing so focus on the risk-free interest rate. The OMT focuses its attention on bonds deriving from regions with the lowest credit rating with a view to reduce the solvency risk premium. I see this as a very different kind of monetary policy measure. A central argument behind the call for support for the OMT program is that a dramatic and uncontrollable crisis would be unleashed if the Eurosystem did not intervene. Other commentators too believe that the Eurosystem is the only European institution capable of taking action. And if I understood Martin Helwig correct, I think that is the basic reason for his view of being grudgingly in favor of OMT. But I think these arguments are to be disputed. If monetary policymakers refrain from intervening and make it clear that they will not intervene, the responsibility and pressure to find a solution will shift to policymakers in other fields.
Das OMT-Programm fand allerdings auch Verteidigung.
How should central bankers act in such an environment? Well, policymakers generally always have the option of doing nothing. Well, they very often use that option, by the way. They can also choose to respond actively to the crisis within their mandate by rethinking, potentially revising the appropriate set of policy instruments. Or they can be passive. So you have this choice between being passive and active, which are two possible options, provided that you are active within your mandate, obviously. But what I would like to note here is that being passive is not an innocent policy stance. Being passive is a policy choice itself, with potential implications for price stability. And I like this quote by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who once observed that there are risks and costs to action, but there are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. So that's what John Fitzgerald Kennedy once said. So both decisions have to be explained, both decisions have to be assessed against the institution's mandate, which in our case is price stability. And in our case, in the case of the ECB, the judgment of the Governing Council was that passivity was not an option if it meant failing to reach the objective of price stability, because of the unraveling and breakup of euro area financial markets that would inevitably have led to deflation. So passivity was not compliant with the ECB mandate. And it's certainly our task within the treaty, as enshrined in the treaty, to do whatever it takes, as Mario Draghi once said, within our mandate, which he also said, to fulfill our objective.
Am Nachmittag wurde in 2 Expertenrunden weiter diskutiert.
There are 2 panels. So the first one is essentially about is there a good economic argument for OMTs? We heard a lot already, but that will be the topic of the first panel. And the second panel is what are the distributional or fiscal consequences of the OMTs?
We have seen that OMT are the instruments that is very effective in dealing with this problem. It's hard to see what other instruments could have been used to deal with this problem, if not through the central bank balance sheets. LTRO, we're trying, but one can make the argument that LTRO are more expensive because that bank liabilities are actually bigger compared to debt liabilities. And also they are inefficient because they persevere in aggravating the link between the bank and the sovereign, as we have seen has happened.
I think OMT is a good idea or not. The key question to me in all of this is an independent central bank that has a clear mandate, and it doesn't have a choice on the mandate. Right? There may be other policies it could do in principle, but it doesn't have a choice on the mandate. The mandate is price stability and support of general economic policies in Europe. That's the mandate, that's what the treaty says. And within the mandate, it's allowed independence and freedom of judgment of how to implement this, but it's not allowed to go beyond this mandate. And the treaty says it in so many words, not to allow to do fiscal bailouts, for example. Right? Within its mandate, could you find a respectable argument that it could do such a thing as OMT?
We can change that. I think everyone can agree on that. We didn't put the right mechanisms in place, and we made a lot of, we misjudged people from the perspective of the central bank of the incentive of governments to do what they promised to do at the outset. At the same time, it's too late to turn back. It's like swimming across the Mississippi River. Once you're halfway there, you may actually make it, but you don't want to go back. So I've been influenced by Charles Wyplosz a lot. I don't agree with it at all, his proposal of buying up the entire debt stock of these troubled countries, but I think he's really understood, and I understand, that if Europe wants this thing to survive, it has to go back to the no bailout principle. We have to do something like the United States. It has to be impossible for Michigan to hold the Fed hostage, for Texas to hold the Fed hostage because its fiscal policy is out of whack. It has to be the case that only capital expenditures are being financed by debt. You can't fund the wages of civil servants as a long-term proposition. Okay, to get there, the ECB has to get stronger. It's already strong enough. We learned that. It's powerful enough to do an OMT, but it has to do even better. Okay, so have a serious discussion about the long-term viability of the ECB, and if we really want this is like crossing the Rubicon. Okay, we're getting rid of something that we all hold dear and near. The Bundesbank, love you guys, but I think we need to move on.
I'm not even going to try to summarize the debate today, but you know, just if you think about the discussions we've had about multiple equilibria, what kind there are, whether they exist, financial fragility, what type of risk we are looking at, whether conditionality is sufficient, can be implemented, do we have still too much moral hazard, and then even, you know, discussions about broader monetary policy, what are the objectives, and finally, can't we fully, you know, think of a redesign of the ECB? Certainly, it has been a very rich day. I certainly think or hope that we have achieved the goal of opening a debate. I don't think we have closed it, and I hope that it's going to go on. So the only way for me to summarize this is in negative terms. I think it's clear that it's not black and white, both with regard to OMT and regard to other monetary policy options. It's also not Germany versus the rest of Europe or the rest of the world. I think it's wrong to interpret this as a question of national interest only. But there are many, as Jens said this morning, shades of grey. And with that, I would like to leave you for today, and thank you very much for coming.